Proverbs and Ecclesiastes belong to a group of literature in the Old Testament that is known as the wisdom literature. These are wise sayings. Most cultures have had wisdom literature handed down from generation to generation. We don't always realize this, but and maybe we're losing some of that in our modern culture, but those who are older can remember how there were wise sayings that grandpa had or your folks had, and they would pass this on as a little bit of wisdom for you to understand and to live by. Well, there's a collection of wisdom sayings in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes that tells us a better way to live. In fact, one of the key words in Proverbs is way or path. You can take this path and it ends in a bad situation. Or you can take a better path over here and it'll lead you to a better destination. Every path leads somewhere. And if you wind up somewhere, I didn't expect to have this happen, maybe you should have thought it through before you got on that path, because that path is going to lead in a certain direction. And the wise man in Proverbs is trying to tell us, my son, listen. If you get on this path, this is where it leads. This is a better path over here. Avoid that one. Okay? And so he's trying to help us make some better choices. And I like that word better. In fact, more than 20 times that expression better or better than occurs in Proverbs. And he's saying this is better than that. Now this may be bad and this is good, or this may be good and this is gooder, or it's better. Okay? So he's saying make the better choice when you have an option out there, whether between bad and good or good and better. Make the better choice. And he's trying to help us be wise in making those choices. Let's give a few examples of this. As you look at your outline here, we have 7 that we want to mention. He says a near neighbor can be better than distant family. Isn't that true? How many times have you heard the story repeated where an older individual died and the widow is left, and she makes the decision that she's going to move out of state to be close to her kids. And so she moves, and she's there in the home, and in the morning her son goes to work, the daughter-in-law goes to work, the kids are off to school, and she's what? She's alone. And she misses that network of friends that she'd had for years back in that little town where she was. In fact, that story is being repeated this week in the Manor House, I understand. There's one of the residents who was there and moved out of state to be close to family. This week she's moving back in to the Manor House. That's not to say that it was a negative thing with the kids, but sometimes the wise man is saying, you may have a good choice here, but maybe this one is better. And if we have the advantage of the input of his wisdom, we can start to weigh sometimes the options. Okay, this is a good option, but I think this one is better, and I'm going to go with this. So a near neighbor can be better than a distant family. On one occasion, Jesus was approached by some people and said, your mother and your brothers are looking for you. They thought he was a little overworked and maybe he was kind of caving under the pressure. And they kind of came to get him, to take him home, to protect him. And Jesus looked around and he said, who is my mother and my brother? It's these who hear the word of God and do it. And what he was saying was there that a spiritual family, these friends in relationship with me through the Word of God, are closer to me than even the flesh and blood. Sometimes a spiritual family, sometimes a good friend is closer than the blood ties. Do not forsake your friend or the friend of your parent. Do not go to the house of your kindred in the day of your calamity. Better is a neighbor who is nearby than kindred who are far away. Sometimes that tie that has been developing for years is something that you have to take into consideration when you want to make a decision. Secondly, here, he says humility looks better on you than presumption. There's a passage in the New Testament that says, clothe yourselves with humility. So before you go out to meet the public every day, you ought to remember to get dressed. And if you don't clothe yourself in humility, you're not adequately dressed for the day. Sometimes we presume certain things, and we're embarrassed because that presumption overrides the humility that ought to be there. For example, maybe I assume I'm the smartest person in the room. They'll listen to me, and then they don't. And maybe they're critical of me, and I get a come down. Or maybe I assume that I'm the cutest person, and I figure that because I'm so cute, they're going to cut me slack, or they're going to show me favor that they wouldn't show to someone else. And that presumption always has a come down to it. Perhaps I presume because I'm the oldest person approaching the door that someone will open it for me and will wait for me to go through. And then I get a rude awakening. No, they're in a hurry and they ignore me and they don't show the proper respect and all of this. Presumption. Humility. If the good thing happens, then let it happen. But don't presume that it's going to happen. And we think, well, I'm well known and they'll know who I am. They'll recognize I'm the mayor of the town, or I'm this special person, and they'll give me deference. I heard a story, and it's probably one of those preacher stories, not really true, but the president went to a convalescent home, and he saw this little old lady sitting in a wheelchair, and he went up and he shook her hand, and he smiled at her, and he says, "Do you know who I am?" She looked him over carefully and said, "No, I don't. But if you'll go to that desk, they can tell you who you are." Okay? Don't presume here. That presumption, rather than humility, is leading to a fall. Haman was one of those individuals who just sort of presumed his self-importance in the book of Esther. And he wanted to get rid of his main enemy, Mordecai. And the king asked him in reference, but he didn't mention the name Mordecai. He says, what should the king do to honor this special person? He thought, well, he's talking about me. So he thought about this parade, and we ought to have this grand festivity that goes on. And when he found out that the grand parade was for his mortal enemy, Mordecai, and he was to lead the horse, that he was on at the front of the parade, that didn't sit well, because he had forgotten to clothe himself with humility before he left home that day. It is better to wait for an invitation to the head table, Jesus said, and he's paraphrasing Proverbs 25, than to be sent away in public disgrace just because you've seen something. You just assume I'm most important and they'll want me there at the place of honor at the head of the table. Jesus said, no. Take a place at the lowly position, the humble position, and then if you're exalted to a place of honor, that's good. But if you take and presume that you're to be in the place of honor, you may have to go down and be embarrassed by all of that. Number 3, saying nothing is better than unkept promises. Sometimes it's better just to say nothing. It is better to say nothing than to make a promise and not keep it. There's a saying that I love: under promise and over deliver. Make few promises but keep them. Under promise, over deliver. Most of us over promise and under deliver. What happens if we make promises and we don't keep them? People begin to wonder, well, who knows? She said, he said, but who knows? And it just kind of breaks down the communication. Jesus says, let your yes be yes. They had this little system to where, I said yes, but I didn't say yes by the altar. I didn't say yes by the gold on the altar. And it kind of graduated until you couldn't get out of it. The equivalent of that, I think, when I was growing up was if you crossed your heart and you hoped to die, you were absolutely committed to doing what you said you were going to do. You meant it for sure. But you could wiggle out of it if someone said, well, you said you, well, I didn't promise. I didn't cross my heart. I didn't give the pinky promise. You know, whatever we do, but to have these gradations of yes, I mean it, and maybe. No, the wise man says it's better just to say nothing than to have an unkept promise. Number 4 here, an honest rebuke is better than foolish flattery. Do you like honest rebukes? Or do you prefer not to get involved with rebukes? Wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. Well, I prefer that, rather than telling me the truth in love and being honest with me, that you tell me lies, little lies, sweet little lies, as the song says. We may prefer that, but a real friend is going to level with us, is going to tell us the truth rather than that. How do you take criticism? How do you take constructive criticism or even negative criticism? Maybe someone is trying to bring you down or is showing disrespect. I still need to hear that. Is there some truth in it? Is there something I can learn from it? A wise person can learn from a fool, but a fool won't learn from anyone. If you're wise and someone says something that is of a rebuke nature or is critical, what do I need to learn from that? Regardless of how I see the individual who gave the rebuke or the criticism, is there something there to be learned? If we're wise, we're better to listen to the rebuke than to enjoy the flattery that we know really is not true. Number 5, better is a little with love or peace than a lot with turmoil. A bowl of vegetables with someone you love is better than steak with someone you hate. Isn't that true? It's the company that makes a meal more than the food that's on the table. And if you're sharing something with someone you love, that's better than sharing steak with someone that you don't love. Proverbs 17, better a dry crust eaten in peace than a house filled with feasting and conflict. Now, Solomon had a special insight on this, apparently, because if you see those other passages there, we're not going to read them. 3 times, chapter 21 and 25, he talks about living with a contentious woman. And he says it's better to live on the housetop, or it's better to be in an isolated desert area than to live with a contentious woman. I bet he wished he had written that advice before he got involved with 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's like the guy who thought about writing a book on raising children when he was 19. He says, I wish I'd written it, because now that I have kids, I could sure use the advice. Solomon didn't listen to his own advice on some of this. And maybe this is a good one to kind of cap off the Thanksgiving time with. How did your Thanksgiving table go? We read on Facebook that some people were uninvited to the Thanksgiving dinner. Family members were uninvited because they voted for the wrong person. Or they may have been unfriended on Facebook because they voted for the wrong person. Johnny Carson said years ago, Thanksgiving is an emotional holiday. People travel thousands of miles to be with people they only see once a year. And then they discover once a year is way too often. He's been feasting in that house where there's conflict. And he says you're better off, instead of having that nice lavish turkey dinner, to have a dry crust of bread and share it with people where there's peace and where there's love. Number 6, better to control anger than to conquer a city. Proverbs 16, whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes the city. Slow to anger. Every one of us has that anger gene. Every one of us has within us the potential to be angry. The Bible says when you're angry, don't let the sun go down on your anger, your wrath. It assumes we're going to be angry. It doesn't say if you're angry, it says when you're angry. There are 2 questions that I think everyone ought to ask when you see yourself getting angry. Number 1, why am I angry? Be honest. If you need to rebuke yourself, rebuke yourself. Well, I'm honest because my feelings were hurt. I'm honest because I was humiliated. I'm honest because he told the truth. Why am I angry? And then number 2, how long am I going to be angry? How long? Make a decision. And Paul said in Ephesians 4 that you need a sunset clause on your anger. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Settle it before nightfall. Because if you do, then you give the devil a foothold. If I go to bed angry, I have one problem. But when I wake up and I'm still angry and I'm nursing that anger, and anger's one of those things that doesn't get better when you nurse it. It gets worse. And it leads to resentment. You know what resentment means? It means you feel it all over again. We're sentient creatures. We can sense or feel things. And when you resent, you're bringing it back, you're feeling it all over again. Every time I think about it, it just makes me madder. We know how that goes. And then you start to get a grudge. And then you start to think malicious thoughts. What can I do to get even? Or to show Mr. Know-it-all, he doesn't know it all. Anger leads eventually to some bad things if there's no time limit on it. Why am I angry? Be honest. And if you're angry at yourself, you have to really be honest, because if you're not, you're going to be depressed and you're not going to know why. But you may know why, but you don't want to admit that I messed up. So it's just easier to be depressed. That's anger pointed inward. But if I'm angry from a source out here, it turns into malicious activities. So why am I angry? How long am I going to be angry? And failure to ask those questions gives the evil one a foothold. And finally here, mourning is sometimes better than laughter. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." I think there are 2 things that are vital to being human. One is laughter, one is tears. There's room for both. We need to know how to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. We need to know when and how to mourn ourselves and our sin and our failure, and to be honest about that. If we don't face that, if we don't have the courage to face our own failure, it's not going to have a good end. That's a path that we don't want to get on. If we know when and how to mourn. It's not whining, but it's mourning in a genuine sense that there's something wrong here that I need to learn from, that I need to know how to fix. The wise man in Ecclesiastes says, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for this is the end of everyone, and the living will lay it to heart." Let me paraphrase that. It is better to go to a funeral than to go to a wedding. Say, "Well, I do weddings, but I don't do funerals." Why don't you do funerals? Well, I don't feel good. What the wise man is saying is, If you go and you're willing to face the reality of death of a loved one or of a friend that's maybe a casual friend, and it brings you up short about how you're going to end the same way with death, there's a benefit there. I don't like the mourning. I don't like the difficulty. I don't like what causes me to mourn. But if I'm listening, Lord, what do you want me to learn through this difficult experience? Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of countenance the heart is made glad. If you know how to weep, if you know how to do that and do it properly, there will be a benefit on the far side. Yes, I'm weak, but you're strong. Yes, I've failed, but you were victorious. Yes, I'm not who I want to be, but I'm becoming who you are. There's something to be learned through that experience, and sometimes God can only teach us through pain. Some lessons have to be learned that way, and we have to stay under the treatment while we're experiencing it. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning. The patient in spirit are better than the proud in spirit. You say, well, I don't like the way this thing started off. I don't like what's happening. He says, be patient. If you're attuned to God, if you're listening to God, if you want to know what can I learn through this difficult experience, you can be better on the other side of this. Count it all joy when you fall into trials, into troubles, into difficult situations, into circumstances that you don't like. Give thanks anyway. Why? Because God is at work in that, and He's maybe using that to develop something within you or within someone else, watching how you react in this situation. We don't know what God is up to, but we're saying here that even though the beginning may be unpleasant, we don't like it, in the upper story, God is doing something either in us or someone around us that is bringing it to a better end. Be patient in tribulation. Be patient in trouble. And God will have a chance to do something in your life that He doesn't have right now. If you were to write your obituary, how would you write that obituary? Some of you heard me tell probably another one of those preacher stories of the preacher who saw his obituary in the paper, and he was shocked. They even spelled his name right, and it was a difficult, unusual name, and all the details of the obituary were correct. And he thought, that can't be. I'm here. He got his phone out. He called one of his elders. He said, did you see my name in the paper this morning? The elder said, yeah. Where are you calling from? How would you like your obituary to appear? You've got a chance to start rewriting by making better choices. Maybe I've chosen something that's not the best here, but I can re-choose and I can make a better choice. And I need the wisdom of God to help me with that choice. Alfred Nobel, you know his name. He had that advantage of seeing his obituary, and he decided to rewrite it. It was actually his brother that died. And in the paper, his obituary appeared. They got them mixed up. You know, some of these famous figures, they write the obituary ahead of time and it goes out to press immediately. One of the things they mentioned in his obituary was that he invented dynamite, which is true. And he thought, I don't want to be remembered for that. That goes with war, that goes with destruction. And so he invested a lot of money into those who were helping to make peace those who were interested in unity, and developed a prize that became known as the Nobel Peace Prize. That's how people remember him today, not as the one who invented dynamite. He saw his obituary and had a chance to rewrite it. You're writing your obituary right now. How will you be remembered? We hope that it is as a wise individual who listened to the voice of God, whether it was under difficult circumstances, and he became a better person because he listened to God rather than to his own inner self or his own feelings. If you need to respond, will you do that while we sing?